In this year's holiday episode of Drive, we thought that we'd do something different. We'll join a four-wheel drive expedition and do it tough in one of the world's dream driving destinations, Outback Australia in the Southern Hemisphere's summer. Australia is unique. It's an island, a country and a continent. It's roughly the same size as the continental United States, but has less than 10% of the population, about 20 million people, and almost all of them live around the coast. After Antarctica, Australia is the driest continent on Earth. It comprises more than 5% of the Earth's land area, yet contributes less than 1% of total global river runoff. The interior is vast, trackless and very empty. Much of it still hasn't been fully explored. The semi-nomadic Aboriginal people who have lived here for over 40,000 years had no need of maps and made none. Our convoy assembled in Port Augusta at the head of the Spencer Gulf, gateway to Central Australia, and headed towards the remote dune country north of Lake Eyre. We would be crossing the paths of many of the early explorers who first charted these remote and inhospitable parts of Australia. In this area, summer shade temperatures regularly reach the 50 degrees Celsius range, while a reading of 61 degrees has been reported. After cruising on the good road which skirts the western side of the hills that make up the Flinders Ranges, we turned off onto private tracks across some of the vast Australian sheep stations and headed east and then south through Thompson's Gap. Out here, you need some pretty special equipment. The standard four-wheel drive vehicle is a remarkable piece of engineering, but if you want to get out here and home again, it will need something extra. Many somethings, in fact. So that the vehicle can travel further through this sort of country that places great demands on fuel consumption, a long-range fuel tank should be fitted. Dual battery systems, air-locking differentials, driving lights, extra spare wheels, heavy-duty front and rear protection, and winches are not just additional luxuries, but necessary modifications for serious off-road driving. Heavy-duty tyres, tough enough to handle mud, sand and sharp rock across a broad spread of temperatures are needed, as is a more robust suspension system. But thorough preparation for a major cross-country trip doesn't stop with modifications to the vehicle's terrain handling capability. Good maps, a global positioning system satellite navigation unit, water storage systems, a refrigerator and camping accessories all contribute to a safer, more comfortable journey. We were heading a long way from the plains to an area where we knew there was permanent water. Legendary explorer Edward Eyre was born in England in 1815, but he wasn't a healthy child and was told the climate in Australia would be better for him, so he set sail at the age of 17. Eyre explored inland South Australia in search of new grazing. His main expedition was in 1840 when he left Adelaide on horseback with a flock of sheep for food. He travelled north, naming both Mount Deception and Mount Hopeless, and discovered the dry inland lake now called Lake Eyre. Despite several expeditions that nearly killed him, he became governor of New Zealand and later Jamaica, before retiring back to England where he died a century ago at the age of 86. We picked up the headwaters of Depot Creek and followed that down to where Eyre had actually camped and stopped there. Before us, other explorers, including Horrocks and Stewart, had used this same water supply. Another famous explorer was British naval officer Matthew Flinders, who was the first to sail around Australia in 1803. And it was he who then suggested the name for the country previously called New Holland and New South Wales. We were heading towards a peak in the Flinders Ranges, named by Matthew Flinders himself. Vegetation had changed again and there was more steep ground. We continued climbing and this time we were going to the top of one of the highest points around. The surface was pretty loose in places and one of the drivers thought he'd try climbing without diff locks engaged. It's a pretty steep hill and the surface is mostly loose shale. Picking the right line and keeping just the right speed is critical. You need to maintain momentum without breaking traction and without stalling. That's it. One wheel on each axle has lost grip. Now it's time to lock the differentials. The vehicle is equipped with a small onboard compressor, and with the flick of a switch, the locks are engaged, and power is transferred to all four wheels. This method of locking the differentials is an aftermarket solution, similar to the system used in Volkswagen's Synchro. On his way back to England, Flinders was arrested as a spy by the French governor on the island of Mauritius. When he was released 6 years later, his discoveries had been claimed by French explorer Nicolas Baudin. To clear his name, Flinders published his journal outlining his discoveries, but he died on the day it appeared in July 1814. This peak is Mount Arthur, named by Flinders in 1801. Flinders proved that mainland Australia was not a series of islands, but just one. And by sailing around Van Diemen's Land, he proved that it was an island, now called Tasmania. His charts were so accurate that they were used for many years after his premature death at the age of just 40. Once over the top of the ridge, the vegetation started to change dramatically. Australia has been enduring a drought for several years, and it shows both in the sparse vegetation and the sparser wildlife. The convoy was faced with still more climbing, the surface all loose shale, and again it's really steep. Out here, too many punctures could spell disaster, and most punctures happen when the sidewalls of the tyres get spiked by iron-hard branches, thorns or rocks.
Do you want to lower your tyre pressures?
Tyre manufacturers don't necessarily recommend this, but very often lowering pressures is the best option. It gives a broader footprint to the tyre, but at the risk of softening those vulnerable sidewalls. It's vital to re-inflate the tyres as soon as possible. Dropping the pressures did make a difference, especially with the diff locks engaged, but this was pretty rough stuff. But now it was time for the recovery gear, a very good reason why off-road expeditions should have several well-equipped vehicles. It took us a while to get it moving again, and the light was fading fast. It's amazing what you can do with a winch. The next day, our track took us through some scenery made famous in the paintings of Sir Hans Heysen. Born in 1877 in Germany, he migrated to Adelaide with his family at the age of 6. More than any other artist, Heysen changed the way Australia saw the gum tree. For many years, he painted the Adelaide Hills and the Flinders Ranges, and Heysen died in 1968, aged 90. We were making a bit of a diversion to visit an historic reserve. Up until 1956, the old railway line came through these parts. When the line was discontinued, the old railway town of Beltana started to decline. Today, it's a ghost town, a relic from the 19th century. In its early days, Beltana was a camel breeding station and later the base for pastoral giant elders. Further up the valley, at Sliding Rock, copper was discovered in these hills, and here are the ruins of a smelter and a mining operation that only worked for 5 years. The track gets close to the Boolaroo goldfields. We saw traces of a few old diggings, but there were no signs of activity now. We had to skirt the edge of a creek before we picked up a faint trail leading to the ruins of the Paul Consolidated Mine. There's a couple of fallen down stone buildings on the stony plain, and on the hillside a few ruins and relics of a brief but rich mining era. By the 1880s, hundreds of mines have been opened up throughout the Flinders Ranges, but none remain. One of the things you come across in remote Australia is bull dust. This sort of superfine dust gets into everything, so if you're carrying vulnerable kit on the roof rack, make sure it's well sealed. The dust hangs in the air for many minutes and will slide through the best air filters, so it's important to blow them clean or change them frequently. It's also vital to keep the revs up when you're driving through this stuff and keep a good distance from any other vehicles in the group. On the 5th day, we found a spot to cross the Frome River. But after an almost puncture-free run, the expedition's mobile kitchen would strike trouble. The Nissan was carrying a lot of weight, and the right rear tyre was destroyed by a very sharp rock and a vehicle loaded to its maximum. The uneven ground meant that jacking up the truck wouldn't be easy, but by using 2 jacks, eventually the wheel was changed.
You reckon leave it there, Terry?
We were headed for another abandoned copper mine. A chimney still stands a little north of the Mount Rose Bore and Mine complex, and the smell of sulphur and leached chemicals still fills the air around the old workings. Even the cockatoos seem sulphur-stained. Just 20 years after Edward Eyre had passed through these rugged ranges, copper was discovered in lots of places. Here at Yundamutna was one of the richest deposits, and a smelter was set up. But like so many of these places, the tyranny of distance, the lack of water, and the remoteness of the area meant that they closed down very quickly. The cemetery nearby bears witness to the harshness of the life led by the pioneer miners and their families. Silent, sun-bleached graves are scattered throughout the outback. At least these are maintained. Many are forgotten or simply unmarked. When you're driving at dusk, a lot of animals are beginning to stir. This is the time of day when bull bars really earn their keep. Good lights are vital. We were leaving the Flinders Ranges behind us, heading into Salt Lake country. Till now, we'd had the luxury of following some sort of track. Soon, there'd be nothing like that. We camped near the ruins of a town that used to be known as Government Gums. In the 1870s, it was boom time, and Government Gums was the terminus of the first part of the Ghan Railway. But by the 1960s, lack of water meant that the town was deserted. About the only way to get a good look at Lake Eyre is from above. A group of the travellers thought we'd have a look. Rainfall across about 1/6 of all of Australia drains into Lake Eyre. The basin is one of the biggest internal drainage systems in the world, covering an area about twice the size of the US state of Texas. However, the creeks and rivers that feed it only flow intermittently, so most of the time it's completely dry. The Danube River would fill Lake Eyre to its highest ever recorded level in 45 days, the Mississippi in 22 and the Amazon in 3 days. The lake's high salt content comes from the evaporation of thousands of years of floodwaters, and the surface patterns show variations in salinity. Annual rainfall is less than 125 millimetres, with an evaporation rate of 2.5 metres. Until the 1920s, William Creek was an important centre for the old narrow-gauge Ghan Railway. There are bits and pieces from those days in a loose collection out the front of the roadhouse, which pretty much is William Creek. The Woomera rocket range was used to develop long-range missiles and atomic weapons for Britain and covers about 130,000 square kilometres. It's the size of England. Sightseeing over, the convoy promptly struck trouble when one vehicle strayed off the track and broke through the thin crust. In a situation like this, a snatch strap to another vehicle is the easiest way out, and it's pretty straightforward. This was our first boggy patch, but we could expect plenty more like this. We picked up a fence line, not marked on the map, and followed it north. Everywhere the ground was soft. We were passing through a dry swamp, a bit of rain, and this would become impossible. Our progress would start to slow down a bit now, with more consulting of maps and the satellite navigation GPS. For this sort of driving, through soft sand, we let the tyre pressures down again and kept the wheels churning through. Keeping to existing tracks helps limit any damage to the environment, and usually avoids the vehicle going through a fragile crust as happened earlier. At Mystery Dam, we hit another fence line at a track that went south. The station had been doing a bit of fence work and there were coils of barbed wire lying around. This camel had got 1 foot wrapped up in some of it. Australia is the last place on Earth that wild camels are still found. Progress through this country was pretty sedate. The GPS can show you which way to go, but it won't show you what you've got to go through. It's a remote and lonely place. It never attracted much attention back then, and it doesn't now. Very few people come this deep into Australia's heart. The surface was a thin, brittle crust which coped well for the first vehicle. Having made the path, other drivers would try and stay in the lead vehicle's tracks to avoid any environmental damage, but this wasn't going to be as easy as it sounds. One by one, the vehicles go through. The last thing you want to do is break through that crust. The ground underneath can be anything from sandy to virtually waterlogged. But after a few vehicles, the surface begins to break up, and pretty soon we'd be unpacking the recovery equipment again. All was looking pretty good until now. A fully equipped and fueled patrol will weigh well over 3 tons, and without a great deal of care, just a bit of wheel spin quickly converts into that sinking feeling of going down, not forward. Stuck, but luckily not in too deep. So the convoy leader marshals a vehicle to hook up a snatch strap to try and pluck the stranded patrol out of the mire. To reach a vehicle on solid ground, the very longest strap available was needed. The equipment isn't very expensive, but like anything involved with driving in the bush, it must be handled with great care and maintained in tip-top condition. This method of extraction relies on the momentum of the front vehicle to stretch the rugged strap and shock the bogged vehicle free, which is also driven with a gentle foot on the throttle so that it's under its own power when it comes free. Sure enough, there's water in the wheel ruts just inches below the dry and desolate surface. At lunch, the flies were eating more than we were. Not for nothing are they sometimes called Australia's national bird. Although it was late in the season, there were plenty of them about. Another supposedly dry creek to cross, and it didn't take long for someone to get stuck. It didn't look too serious, but these things can take a while. So, as the experts took care of the problem, there was time for some frog racing.
Hey, we have a winner!
Now it wasn't looking quite so easy. For the snatch strap to work, the front vehicle needs to get some speed up. But with diffs locked and all 4 wheels driving, he was able to drive out.
You have another crack, Megan? Alright, he's driving it.
We had some high ridges to cross in country little changed since Warburton had seen it. Peter Warburton spent 21 years in the British Army in India before taking command of the South Australian Police in 1853, aged 40. He delighted in exploring beyond the outposts under his command, and in 1872 he was asked to lead an expedition to find a route to Perth across an area of 500,000 square miles described as the greatest blank on the face of the globe. In 1873, Warburton's expedition, the first to be equipped entirely with camels, left Alice Springs. 15 months later, on the point of starvation, they reached the Oakover River, 800 miles north of Perth. It was late in the day, and what had looked like a reasonable place to cross turned out to be a quagmire.
Where's all that water coming from up in there?
The Hilux was up to its axles. By now, the team was practiced at this sort of thing, so we set up for yet another snatch recovery. Then, one of the team went and got himself bogged, and everyone knew it was going to be a tough job to get the vehicle out. It moved, but not much. The snatch strap wasn't going to work, so the next alternative is using one of the electric winches mounted solidly to the front of each vehicle. Used in conjunction with a delicate bit of reversing, the winch should be able to reel the Hilux in like a muddy catfish. The winch worked beautifully, but it was moving the wrong vehicle. So we brought up a second car. If you follow the correct procedures, a winch recovery is quite safe. Everyone who handles the winch cables should be wearing gloves. Frayed strands can rip into unprotected hands. Careful coordination between winch operators is vital to pull evenly and effectively. Two winches and still not much was happening. As the sun got really low in the sky, two more vehicles were brought into play. No gloves, a bad idea. Winch cables have been known to snap or come loose when under tension, and they fly like a whip and can do severe damage. It's a big no-no to step over a winch cable when it's got a 2-ton vehicle on each end. It's easy to forget safety procedures in the heat of the moment, and situations like this are always heated moments. Frustration at the end of a long, hot day with not much progress can lead to costly mistakes, where patience and care aren't always on hand. Success at last, and almost at last light. The next day we needed to cover 80 kilometres or so to have any chance of arriving at Birdsville when we'd planned. We swung south of our planned track to pick up better running closer to the lake. Recoveries like this were starting to feel routine, but we still had a few more steep and badly eroded dunes to cross. When a car gets stuck on a steep angle like this, its stability is often compromised. When it does start to move, it can easily roll over. Australian wild camels are now exported back to the Middle East. Tackling a slope head-on is always a lot safer. GPS technology is fairly recent. Map makers have only been able to use it for the last 10 years to make maps more accurate. Four-wheel drive users know the advantage of having a GPS aboard. With a laptop computer and moving map software, they can literally make their own. Some lakes are safe to drive on. The trick is knowing which is which. At White Bull Bore, the water gushes out at close to boiling point, so a hot bath was a welcome stop. The water flows down a cooling channel until it's cold enough for the livestock to drink. Sparrow's Landing, the most northerly point reached by Colonel Warburton. In November 1874, he went back to England after an absence lasting 40 years. However, he didn't like the climate and returned to Adelaide after 4 weeks and died there 15 years later. 2 ranges of hills, a river and a beetle are named after him. The Birdsville track is not a superhighway, and it can be badly corrugated, which will cause the shock absorbers to heat up. Another component that needs to be uprated to cope with the harsh conditions experienced in outback Australia. Late in the afternoon, we reached Birdsville. It was a convoy of thirsty latter-day explorers that rolled into the small town, which, not surprisingly, is centred around the famous Birdsville pub. We had left Spencer Gulf 14 days before and had seen some of the most remote parts of Australia. We'd been well prepared for this trip and the preparation had paid off. The equipment that helped us get here had performed beautifully. Now all we had to do was get home again, but not tonight. If you'd like to buy a full-length DVD of the entire Desert Extreme expedition, please visit www.guidebooks.com.au.